I remember the exact quality of light that evening, how it slanted through the living room windows like something ending. Dusk had always been my least favorite time of day, that suspended moment when the world holds its breath between what was and what might be. I sat alone on the couch, my hands folded in my lap, watching dust particles drift through the last golden beams of sun. The house felt enormous around me, filled with the kind of silence that makes you aware of your own heartbeat, your own breathing, the small sounds your body makes when it thinks no one is listening. It was a Tuesday in October, the kind of autumn evening when the air carries the scent of dying leaves and distant wood smoke. Through the windows, I could see our neighbors moving through their own lives behind lit rectangles. Mrs. Peterson washing dishes at her kitchen sink, the Johnsons' television flickering blue against their living room walls. Normal people living normal lives, their choices long since made and settled into comfortable routine. I envied them that certainty, even as it suffocated me. On the coffee table in front of me lay an envelope I had been avoiding for 3 weeks. The return address was embossed in navy blue. Millfield High School class of 1995, 25-year reunion. I could see my name written in careful script across the cream paper, but I hadn't touched it. Some invitations feel like summons to a life you've spent decades trying to forget. The envelope had arrived on a Monday morning, mixed in with bills and grocery store circulars. Clara had brought in the mail as she always did, sorting it into neat piles on the kitchen counter. She had noticed this one immediately, holding it up with raised eyebrows and asking if I planned to attend. I had mumbled something noncommittal about being busy, about having papers to grade, about 25 years being too long to pretend you remembered people you had deliberately forgotten. But that wasn't entirely true, and we both knew it. There were some people from high school I remembered perfectly, with a clarity that time had only sharpened. Some memories don't fade. They just burrow deeper, waiting. My wedding ring caught the dying light as I reached for my coffee cup, the gold band suddenly feeling heavier than usual on my finger. 23 years I had worn it, through seasons of contentment and stretches of quiet desperation, through the birth of our daughter and her eventual departure for college. It had become part of me, this circle of metal, as unconscious as breathing. From upstairs came the sound of Clara's voice, steady and warm as it always was. "Nathaniel," she called down, reminding me about dinner with the Hendersons at 7. Her words floated down the stairwell like something rehearsed, part of the comfortable rhythm we had built together over more than 2 decades. I called back that I remembered, my voice automatically matching her tone of domestic normalcy. But the invitation still lay there, unopened, accusatory in its innocence. I picked it up finally, feeling the weight of expensive paper between my fingers. For a moment I considered opening it, reading the details, perhaps even responding. Instead, I found myself reaching for the novel I had abandoned weeks earlier, a paperback copy of something literary and forgettable. I slipped the envelope between its pages like a bookmark, hiding it somewhere in the middle where I wouldn't have to see it again. As I flipped through the book, looking for a place to bury the invitation deeper, something unexpected fluttered to the floor. A photograph, old and slightly faded, landing face up on the hardwood at my feet. I stared down at it for several heartbeats before bending to pick it up, my fingers suddenly clumsy, as if I had forgotten how to perform such a simple task. 2 boys looked back at me from the glossy surface. Teenagers, caught in a moment of pure, unguarded joy. One was unmistakably me at 17, my hair longer then, my face softer, my smile genuine in a way I had almost forgotten was possible. I looked so young, so unaware of the weight that would eventually settle on my shoulders. The other boy stood beside me, his arm thrown casually over my shoulders, both of us laughing at something beyond the camera's frame. His name came to me unbidden, Julian. Julian with his dark eyes and his easy smile. Julian who had made me feel like I could be anyone, become anything. We were standing in a field somewhere, Miller's Creek, I remembered suddenly. The grass tall around us, the sky impossibly blue behind our heads. It must have been spring of our senior year, before graduation scattered us all to different colleges, different lives, different versions of ourselves. Before I learned to be careful, to measure each gesture, to bury certain kinds of longings so deep they became geological features of my internal landscape. I had forgotten this photograph existed. I had forgotten I had kept it, forgotten how we looked together, how easy it had been between us before we learned to be afraid. But holding it now, I could almost smell the spring air of that long-ago afternoon, could almost hear Julian's voice saying my name in that particular way he had, like it meant something more than just a collection of syllables. My hands trembled slightly as I held it, as if the paper might burn me. The sound of Clara's footsteps on the stairs made me move without thinking. I shoved the photograph back into the book, closing it with more force than necessary, my heart suddenly racing for reasons I couldn't name or wouldn't admit. By the time she appeared in the doorway, I was sitting exactly as before, my hands folded, my face composed. She asked if I was ready to go, and I nodded, standing to follow her toward the life we had built together. But the photograph remained trapped between those pages, and with it, the memory of a different version of myself, one who had laughed freely in open fields, one who had allowed another boy's arm to rest across his shoulders without fear or shame. As I walked toward the kitchen where Clara waited with her car keys and her gentle smile, I felt the weight of that contradiction settling over me like a familiar coat. The careful life I had constructed, the roles I played so well they had become indistinguishable from truth. Husband, father, teacher, neighbor, each identity layered over the others until the original shape underneath became unrecognizable, even to myself. And somewhere beneath it all, buried but not dead, the ghost of the boy I had been before I learned to hide. Before I discovered that some kinds of happiness were too dangerous to pursue, some versions of love too risky to name. The boy who had stood laughing in a field with his best friend's arm across his shoulders, believing that joy was simple and within reach, that the future was something you chose rather than something that chose you. The reunion invitation remained hidden between those pages, along with the photograph and all the questions I had spent 25 years refusing to ask. But avoidance, I was beginning to understand, is not the same thing as resolution. Some doors, once opened, can never quite close again. Some ghosts, once awakened, grow restless in their graves. The Hendersons lived 3 streets over in a house identical to ours, part of the planned community we had moved to when Sarah was still small enough to need a backyard swing set. That evening, as Clara and I sat in their dining room, making polite conversation about property taxes and the new shopping center going up on Route 9, I found myself studying the careful architecture of suburban contentment. The matching furniture sets, the family photographs arranged just so on the mantelpiece, the wine glasses that came out only for company. All of it felt both familiar and foreign, like a language I had learned to speak fluently without ever understanding what the words actually meant. I was 48 years old and had been teaching English at Millfield High School for 22 years. Every morning I woke at 6:15, showered, and dressed in one of the pressed button-down shirts that Clara laid out for me the night before. I drank my coffee from the same blue mug, read the same sections of the newspaper, and arrived at school by 7:30 to prepare for another day of guiding teenagers through the mysteries of literature and composition. My classroom was on the 2nd floor, overlooking the parking lot where I had once walked as a student myself. Sometimes, watching the current crop of seniors navigate their final year, I felt like a ghost haunting his own past. They seemed so young to me now, these 17-year-olds with their urgent friendships and their absolute certainty about everything. I remembered that feeling, that sense that the whole world was waiting for you to step into it and claim your place. What I couldn't remember was when I had stopped believing that was true. The students liked me well enough. I was Mr. Morrison, the teacher who assigned manageable amounts of homework and didn't lose his temper when they forgot to turn things in. I taught them about symbolism and theme, about the difference between showing and telling, about how the best stories were often the ones that left certain things unsaid. I wondered sometimes if they could sense the irony in that last lesson, coming from a man who had built his entire life on the principle of leaving the most important things unspoken. After school, instead of driving straight home, I had developed the habit of walking. It was only 2 miles from the school to our house, a pleasant route that took me through the older part of town where the streets had actual names instead of numbers, and the houses showed their age in the graceful way of things built to last. I told Clara it was for the exercise, and that wasn't entirely a lie. But the real reason was simpler and more complicated. I needed that time between one role and another, that buffer zone where I could be neither teacher nor husband, just a man walking through the lengthening shadows of afternoon. It was during those walks that I felt most like myself, though I couldn't have said exactly what that self was. I noticed things on foot that I missed from behind the wheel of a car, the way light moved through the branches of the old oak trees, the sound of children playing in distant backyards, the smell of someone's dinner cooking and drifting out through an open kitchen window. Sometimes I caught myself watching the men I passed. A father pushing a stroller, a jogger stretching against a telephone pole, two guys unloading lumber from the back of a pickup truck. I told myself I was just observing, the way riders are supposed to observe the world around them. But there was something else in those glances, a hunger I didn't want to name. At home, the photographs on our mantelpiece told the story Clara preferred to remember. Our wedding day, both of us young and serious in front of the church altar. Sarah's baby pictures, her first steps, her high school graduation, family vacations to the beach, to the mountains, to Disney World when she was 12 and still believed in magic. In every photo, we looked like what we were supposed to be, a stable, middle-class family living a stable, middle-class life. But I had begun to notice something in those pictures that troubled me. In almost every one, I appeared somehow separate from Clara and Sarah, even when I was standing right next to them. My smiles looked careful, measured, as if I were performing happiness rather than feeling it. My posture was always slightly turned away, my eyes often looking at something beyond the camera's frame. It was subtle, the kind of thing you might not notice unless you were looking for it. But once I started seeing it, I couldn't stop. Clara and I had settled into the rhythm of long marriage, where conversation became a series of logistics and small kindnesses. She asked about my day, I asked about hers. She told me about her book club, I told her about difficult students. We shared meals and household duties and the comfortable silence of people who had learned each other's patterns so well that surprises were rare and not entirely welcome. We still shared a bed, but we rarely touched except in the unconscious way of familiar bodies finding their places in the dark. Sometimes, lying awake beside her, listening to her quiet breathing, I felt a loneliness so vast it seemed to have its own geography. It wasn't that I didn't love her. I did, in the way you love someone who has been kind to you, who has built a life with you, who deserves better than the half-hearted version of devotion I was capable of giving. But love, I was beginning to understand, came in different shapes and sizes, and some of them were more dangerous than others. On Sundays, I mowed the lawn. It was a ritual that had somehow become mine over the years, this careful tending of our small square of suburban grass. Back and forth across the yard in parallel lines, the smell of cut grass and gasoline, the satisfying hum of the engine drowning out the quieter sounds of my own restlessness. Our neighbors did the same thing, each of us in our separate yards, maintaining the illusion that order could be imposed on the natural world through consistent effort and the right equipment. But sometimes, in the middle of these ordinary tasks, I would catch myself wondering what it would feel like to just stop, to set down the mower, walk away from the half-finished lawn, and keep walking until I reached some place where no one knew my name or expected me to be anything other than what I actually was. The thought terrified and thrilled me in equal measure, which is how I knew it was dangerous. Sarah called once a week from college, usually on Sunday evenings. She was studying psychology, had a boyfriend named Marcus who seemed decent enough from the few times we had met him, and was thinking about graduate school. Her life was unfolding exactly as it should, full of possibilities and choices that hadn't been narrowed down by time and circumstance. I was proud of her and envious of her in ways I couldn't explain, even to myself. During one of these calls, she asked me if I was happy. The question came out of nowhere, slipped into our usual conversation about classes, and whether like a stone thrown into still water. I told her of course I was happy, that I had everything a man could want, a good job, a loving family, a nice house in a safe neighborhood. She was quiet for a moment, and then she said that happiness and having everything you're supposed to want weren't necessarily the same thing. After I hung up the phone, I sat in the kitchen for a long time, staring out the window at the yard I had spent so many Sundays perfecting. For the first time in years, I allowed myself to wonder, what if she was right? It was Clara who found the invitation again, 3 days after Sarah's phone call. I had hidden it so well that I had almost convinced myself it didn't exist, buried as it was between the pages of that forgotten novel. But Clara had been tidying the living room, straightening the books on the side table, when it fluttered out and landed at her feet like some persistent ghost refusing to stay buried. She picked it up and studied it with the careful attention she brought to all household matters, reading the elegant script as if it were a utility bill that needed paying. When she looked up at me, her expression held that particular mixture of gentle curiosity and quiet determination that I had learned to recognize over 23 years of marriage. "You should go," she said, settling beside me on the couch with the invitation balanced between us like evidence in a case I didn't want to argue. "It might be good for you to see old friends again. You've seemed so restless lately." The word restless hung in the air between us, loaded with implications neither of us wanted to examine too closely. I tried to deflect, mentioning papers to grade and the fall parent conferences coming up, but Clara was persistent in the way that only truly patient people can be. She reminded me that I had barely taken a day off all semester, that I had been working too hard, that everyone deserved a break from routine now and then. In the end, I agreed because it was easier than explaining why I couldn't. Because the alternative was a conversation about feelings and needs and the growing distance between us that we had both learned to navigate around like furniture in a familiar room. I told her I would go for an hour, maybe two, just long enough to show my face and prove to myself that the past was truly past. The reunion was held on a Saturday night in the high school gymnasium, the same space where I had attended dances and assemblies and graduation ceremonies a quarter-century before. Someone had tried to dress it up with strings of white lights and borrowed tablecloths, but underneath the decorations it was still unmistakably a gymnasium, smelling faintly of floor wax and old sneakers and the particular mustiness of a room that had witnessed too many adolescent dreams and disappointments. I arrived fashionably late, hoping to slip in unnoticed and leave the same way. The music was exactly what you would expect. Hits from our senior year played at a volume that suggested we were all still 18 and invincible. Groups of people clustered around cocktail tables, their conversations punctuated by bursts of laughter that seemed to echo with forced enthusiasm. Everyone looked older, of course, but also somehow smaller, as if the years had worn away the sharp edges of the personalities I remembered. I recognized faces but struggled with names, engaged in the ritual exchange of pleasantries about careers and children and the shocking speed with which time had passed. Most of my former classmates had stayed in the area, their lives following predictable trajectories from high school to college to marriage to mortgages. They asked about Clara, about Sarah, about my years of teaching. I gave the expected answers, played my part in the familiar performance of successful middle age. But I felt like an actor who had forgotten his lines, disconnected from the laughter and the nostalgia swirling around me. These people had been part of my daily life for 4 years, yet standing among them now, I felt like a stranger visiting a country where I had never quite learned to speak the language fluently. I was considering making my escape, calculating how long I needed to stay to satisfy Clara's expectations, when I saw him across the room. Julian stood by the refreshment table, one hand casually wrapped around a plastic cup of punch, his posture relaxed in that way that suggested he was comfortable in his own skin. 25 years had changed him. There was gray threading through his dark hair now, lines around his eyes that spoke of laughter and weather and the accumulated weight of living. But he was unmistakably the boy from the photograph, the one who had thrown his arm around my shoulders in that distant field. Our eyes met across the crowded gymnasium, and I felt something fundamental shift inside my chest, as if time had folded in on itself and collapsed the distance between 17 and 48. He smiled, that same easy grin I remembered, and raised his cup in a small salute that could have been greeting or acknowledgement or something more complicated that had no name. I should have looked away. I should have found someone else to talk to, should have made my excuses and driven home to the safety of my ordered life. Instead, I found myself walking toward him, drawn by a gravitational pull I had forgotten existed. "Nathaniel Morrison," he said when I reached him, as if no years had passed at all. "I was wondering if you'd show up tonight." His voice was deeper now, seasoned by time and experience, but it carried the same warmth that had made me feel chosen all those years ago. We shook hands, a gesture that seemed both formal and inadequate, and fell into conversation with the awkward politeness of people trying to bridge a quarter-century gap. He told me he lived in the city now, that he was a painter, had never married, traveled when he could afford to. His life sounded bohemian and slightly impractical in a way that made my suburban existence feel heavy and overfurnished by comparison. When he asked about my life, I gave him the standard summary: teaching, marriage, daughter in college, but the words felt hollow as I spoke them. "You haven't changed much," he said after I finished recounting the acceptable version of my adult life. There was something in his voice that suggested he meant more than just my physical appearance, something that made me aware of how carefully I was holding myself, how precisely I was measuring each word before speaking it. As the evening wore on, we found ourselves talking with increasing ease, slipping back into a rhythm that felt dangerously familiar. He had always been able to do this, to make conversation feel like confession, to ask questions that went just deep enough to matter without crossing lines that couldn't be uncrossed. We talked about books and movies, about the teachers we remembered and the classmates who had surprised us by becoming entirely different people than we had expected. But underneath the safe topics, I could feel the weight of everything we weren't saying, all the history we were carefully stepping around like broken glass scattered across the floor of memory. There were moments when he looked at me with an intensity that made me remember what it had felt like to be seen, truly seen, by another person. And there were moments when I caught myself looking back with the same dangerous attention. As the evening wound down and people began making their goodbyes, Julian touched my arm lightly, a gesture so brief it might have been accidental if not for the deliberate way he met my eyes afterward. "It was good to see you, Nathaniel," he said. "Really good." He pressed something into my hand then, a small piece of paper folded once, warm from his pocket. "In case you'd like to catch up properly sometime," he added, his voice casual, but his gaze anything but. I tucked the paper into my jacket pocket without looking at it, some instinct for self-preservation keeping me from examining what he had given me in that crowded room full of witnesses to my former life. We said goodbye with another inadequate handshake, and I watched him walk away into the parking lot, disappearing into the darkness beyond the gymnasium's fluorescent glow. The drive home passed in a blur of familiar streets and stop signs, my hands steady on the steering wheel while my mind raced through the implications of the evening. Clara was already asleep when I arrived, the house quiet and orderly around me as I hung up my jacket and loosened my tie. But later, lying in bed beside her, I pulled out the folded scrap of paper and stared at it in the darkness. 10 digits written in Julian's careful handwriting, numbers that represented a door I could choose to open or leave permanently closed. I should have thrown it away, should have torn it into small pieces and flushed them down the bathroom sink, erasing the temptation before it had time to take root. Instead, I folded it carefully and slipped it into my wallet, where it would wait like a loaded question that demanded an answer I wasn't ready to give. I kept Julian's phone number for 2 weeks before I called. It lived in my wallet like a secret, folded behind my driver's license where I could feel it every time I reached for my credit card or my school ID. Some days I forgot it was there entirely, lost in the familiar rhythms of lesson plans and faculty meetings and Clara's gentle questions about whether I had enjoyed the reunion. Other days it felt like it was burning a hole through the leather, impossible to ignore. The call itself was almost anticlimactic. I used my cell phone during my lunch break, standing in the empty hallway outside my classroom while students ate their sandwiches and gossiped in the cafeteria below. When Julian answered, His voice warm and unsurprised. He suggested coffee as if we had been meeting regularly for years. We chose a small cafe in the next town over, the kind of place where nobody from Millfield was likely to recognize either of us. It seemed like a reasonable precaution, though I couldn't have said exactly what I was being cautious about. Julian was an old friend, after all. There was nothing inappropriate about two middle-aged men having coffee and catching up on lost time. That first meeting felt stilted, artificial in a way our reunion conversation had not. We were trying too hard to be casual, to pretend that 25 years could be bridged with small talk about weather and current events. But gradually, as the afternoon stretched longer than either of us had planned, we began to find our way back to something more genuine. Julian told me about his life with a frankness that both fascinated and unsettled me. He had never married, had lived with a few different people over the years, but nothing that lasted more than a couple of seasons. He spoke about relationships the way I might discuss books I had enjoyed but hadn't felt compelled to reread. His attitude toward commitment seemed so foreign to me, so deliberately untethered, that I found myself envying him even as I couldn't imagine living that way myself. He had been painting seriously for about 10 years, he said, mostly landscapes and portraits that he sold at local galleries and art shows. It was a precarious way to make a living, but it gave him freedom to travel when inspiration struck, to follow light and color and whatever moved him in the moment. When he talked about his work, his whole face changed, became animated in a way that reminded me powerfully of the boy he had been. We began meeting regularly after that, always in neutral locations, always with the pretense of innocent friendship. A different cafe each time, or sometimes walks along the river path that wound through the old part of town where we had both grown up. Our conversations ranged across decades of accumulated experience, filling in the gaps between 18 and 48 with the kind of careful honesty that develops between people who are rediscovering each other. I found myself looking forward to these meetings with an anticipation that felt dangerous in its intensity. During faculty meetings or parent conferences, I would catch myself thinking about something Julian had said, or wondering what he was painting, or planning what I might tell him about my week. The hours between our scheduled meetings began to feel like intervals to be endured rather than lived. It was during one of our evening walks, as autumn was deepening toward winter, that something shifted between us. We had been talking about books, about the novels that had shaped us in high school and the ones we had discovered since. The conversation had taken on that particular intimacy that develops in low light, when the darkness makes confession easier. Julian was telling me about a trip he had taken to Italy the previous spring, describing the quality of light in Florence with the kind of precise attention that made me see it through his eyes. As he gestured to illustrate some point about shadow and perspective, his hand brushed against mine. It was brief, possibly accidental, but the contact sent something electric racing up my arm and straight to my chest. I must have made some involuntary sound, a sharp intake of breath, maybe, or a barely audible gasp, because Julian stopped mid-sentence and looked at me with sudden focus. Neither of us moved to break the accidental contact. For a moment that stretched longer than it should have, we stood there on the darkening path with our hands touching, the space between us charged with possibilities neither of us had been willing to name. Then Julian smiled, soft and knowing, and stepped back just far enough to restore the safe distance we had been maintaining. He didn't apologize for the touch or pretend it hadn't happened. Instead, he simply let the silence expand around us while we continued walking, as if something had been acknowledged without needing to be discussed. These moments began to accumulate between us, glances that lingered a beat too long, conversations that strayed into territory that felt increasingly personal, the kind of attention that friends give each other, but with an undercurrent of something more complex. I told myself I was imagining it, that I was reading too much into ordinary gestures of friendship. But Julian had always been able to see through my careful defenses, even when we were teenagers. One evening in late November, as we walked along the river in the early darkness, he asked me a question that seemed casual but felt loaded with intention. "Do you ever wonder why people like holding hands so much?" he said, his tone conversational, but his eyes watching my face carefully. It's such a simple thing, really. Just skin touching skin. But there's something about it that feels significant. I told him I had never really thought about it, which was a lie. I had been thinking about it constantly since that evening when our hands had brushed together, wondering what it would feel like to reach for his deliberately instead of by accident. Maybe you could show me, he said then, so quietly I almost thought I had imagined it. We had stopped walking. I could hear the river moving in the darkness beside us, could smell the cold promise of winter in the air, could see my breath forming small clouds in the space between us. My heart was beating so loudly I was certain Julian could hear it. I should have made some excuse, should have laughed off his suggestion as a joke between old friends. Instead, I found myself looking down at his hand, hanging loose at his side, and then slowly, hesitantly, reaching for it with my own. Our fingers touched first, tentative and questioning, and then gradually our palms pressed together and our fingers interlaced. The fit was perfect, as if our hands had been designed to hold each other. The contact was electric in its simplicity, more intimate than anything I had experienced in years of marriage. Neither of us spoke. The night felt suspended around us, infinite in its possibilities, as if we could stand there forever with our hands joined and the rest of the world would simply wait. When I finally tried to pull away, some instinct for self-preservation overriding the pleasure of the moment, Julian's fingers tightened gently around mine. Not yet, his voice said in the darkness, and I discovered that I didn't want to let go either. The memory of Julian's hand in mine followed me home that night, like a shadow I couldn't shake. It lived in my fingers, in the phantom warmth where our palms had pressed together, in the perfect way our fingers had interlaced, as if they had been practicing that precise configuration for 25 years. In the bathroom, brushing my teeth beside Clara as I had done nearly every night of our marriage, I caught sight of myself in the mirror and felt like I was looking at a stranger. The man staring back at me appeared exactly the same as always, same graying hair, same lines around the eyes, same careful expression of domestic contentment. But something fundamental had shifted behind the familiar features, as if I had been half asleep for decades and was only now beginning to wake up. Clara asked if I had enjoyed my walk, her voice carrying that particular tone of gentle inquiry that meant she had noticed I was later than usual. I told her it had been nice, that the cold air had felt good after being inside all day. The lie came easily, practiced, but it left a bitter taste in my mouth that had nothing to do with toothpaste. Sleep was impossible that night. I lay awake listening to Clara's quiet breathing, staring at the ceiling and replaying those minutes by the river over and over again. The way Julian had looked at me when I reached for his hand, the slight tremor in his fingers when our skin first touched, the way he had said, "Not yet," when I tried to pull away, as if he understood something about what I needed that I was only beginning to recognize myself. In the darkness, I allowed myself to acknowledge what I had been avoiding for weeks. Every moment I spent with Julian carried more genuine intimacy than years of my marriage. When he laughed at something I said, when he listened with that complete attention he had always possessed, when he looked at me as if he saw something worth seeing, those moments felt more real, more essentially true, than anything in my carefully constructed suburban life. The realization should have horrified me. Instead, it felt like finally exhaling after holding my breath for so long I had forgotten what normal breathing felt like. Over the following weeks, as winter settled over the town in earnest, Julian and I continued our walks. But something had changed between us since that evening by the river. The pretense of casual friendship had worn thin, replaced by a charge in the air that neither of us acknowledged directly, but both of us felt constantly. Our conversations became more personal, more honest, straying into territory that felt increasingly dangerous. He told me about the men he had loved, speaking with a frankness that both thrilled and terrified me. There had been a professor in graduate school who broke his heart, a fellow artist in New York who taught him that desire and compatibility were not always the same thing, a musician he had followed to California for 6 months before realizing that some dreams are meant to be admired from a distance. I found myself hanging on every detail of these stories, hungry for a vocabulary of experience I had never allowed myself to learn. Julian spoke about love and loss and the complicated geography of the human heart, as if these were subjects worth serious discussion, as if the feelings I had spent my entire adult life burying were actually worthy of light and air and careful examination. When he asked about my marriage, I found myself giving him answers that surprised me with their honesty. I told him about the comfortable distance that had grown between Clara and me, about the way we moved through our days like actors who had memorized their lines so well they could perform them without thinking. I described the loneliness of lying next to someone you care about but don't truly desire, the particular kind of sadness that comes from building a life on foundations that feel increasingly unstable. It wasn't that I didn't love Clara, I explained. She was a good person, a devoted mother, a faithful partner who deserved better than the half-hearted version of devotion I was capable of giving. But love, I was learning, came in different intensities and colors, and some of them were more dangerous than others. Julian listened without judgment, his dark eyes reflecting understanding rather than surprise. There was something about his attention that made confession feel not like betrayal, but like archaeology, carefully excavating pieces of myself that had been buried so long I had forgotten they existed. The conversation that changed everything happened on a Thursday night in December as we walked beneath the old street lamps of downtown Millfield. Snow had begun to fall, soft flakes that caught the light and dissolved on our jackets before we could brush them away. The town looked different in the snow, softer somehow, as if the sharp edges of familiar places had been gentled by the weather. We had been walking in comfortable silence when Julian suddenly stopped beneath one of the antique street lamps the town council had installed to encourage tourism. The light cast a golden circle around us, creating the illusion of being on a stage where the rest of the world had faded to black. "Nathaniel," he said, his voice quieter than usual, carrying a weight that made me look at him more carefully. He was struggling with something. I could see it in the way he held his shoulders, in the careful way he was choosing his words. When he spoke again, his voice carried a tremor that I had never heard before. I used to wonder what would have happened if we hadn't been so afraid back then. The words hung in the cold air between us like visible things, like snow that refused to melt. I knew instantly what he meant, could feel the truth of it settling into my bones with a recognition that was almost physical. We had been afraid. Of ourselves, of each other, of the implications of feelings that had no acceptable outlet in the world we inhabited as teenagers. All those afternoons we had spent together, all those moments that had felt charged with something neither of us had been brave enough to name. The way he used to look at me when he thought I wasn't paying attention. The way I had memorized every detail of his face, every inflection of his voice, every gesture that made him uniquely himself. The photograph I had kept hidden for 25 years, preserving evidence of a joy so pure and uncomplicated that I had forgotten such feelings were possible. I felt something crack open inside my chest, some carefully maintained wall finally, giving way under the accumulated pressure of decades. For the first time in my adult life, I allowed myself to imagine, what if I had been braver at 17? What if I had reached for his hand, then the way I had reached for it by the river? What if I had allowed myself to love him the way every instinct in my body had been telling me to love him? The life I might have lived spread out before me like a map of a country I had never been allowed to visit. Different choices, different paths, different versions of happiness that I had convinced myself were impossible or wrong or simply not meant for people like me. Standing there in the falling snow, looking into Julian's eyes and seeing my own longing reflected back at me, I understood with crystalline clarity that I had been living half a life. All these years of careful compromise and measured contentment, all these years of convincing myself that duty was the same thing as love, all these years of choosing safety over truth, they collapsed in that moment like a house of cards in a sudden wind. The realization was terrifying and liberating in equal measure. Terrifying because it meant acknowledging the magnitude of what I had given up, the person I had refused to become, the love I had turned away from before it ever had the chance to fully form. Liberating because it meant that the restlessness I had been feeling, The sense that something essential was missing from my life finally had a name and a face and a possibility for resolution. I had been afraid for so long that I had forgotten what it felt like to want something desperately enough to risk everything for it. But standing there with Julian in the gentle snow, his confession hanging between us like an invitation to a different kind of life, I remembered. "Julian," I said, his name coming out like a prayer or a promise or both. He stepped closer then, close enough that I could see the snow caught in his eyelashes, close enough to feel the warmth radiating from his body in the cold night air. Neither of us moved to touch the other, but the space between us hummed with possibility, with the weight of all the years we had lost and the future we might still be able to claim. For the first time in my adult life, I felt completely, dangerously awake. The breaking point came on a Sunday morning in January, 3 weeks after that snowy evening, when Julian and I had finally spoken the truth that had been waiting 25 years to be acknowledged. I was sitting at the kitchen table grading essays about The Great Gatsby, surrounded by the comfortable domestic sounds of a weekend morning. Clara moving quietly through her own routines, the coffee maker gurgling, the radiator clicking as it warmed the house against the winter cold. It should have been peaceful, this scene of marital contentment, but instead it felt like a stage set where I was playing a role I no longer remembered how to inhabit convincingly. My students had written about dreams deferred and the corruption of the American ideal, about the green light that represented everything Gatsby couldn't have. As I read their earnest attempts to analyze Fitzgerald's symbolism, I found myself thinking about my own green light. Not a beacon across dark water, but a man standing beneath a street lamp, offering me a version of myself I had been too afraid to claim when I was young enough to believe anything was possible. Clara must have noticed something in my posture or the way I was staring at the same page without turning it. She appeared beside me with a fresh cup of coffee, setting it down gently next to my elbow in the way she had done countless Sunday mornings before. But instead of returning to her own tasks, she lingered, her hand resting lightly on my shoulder. "Nathaniel," she said, her voice carrying that particular tone of gentle inquiry that I had learned to dread. "Is something wrong?" The question hung in the air between us, loaded with implications neither of us wanted to examine too closely. I could have deflected, could have blamed work stress or winter doldrums, or any number of acceptable explanations for the distance that had been growing between us. Instead, I found myself looking up at her face, really looking, perhaps for the first time in months, and seeing not just my wife, but a woman who deserved honesty even when the truth might break both our hearts. Clara had always been more perceptive than I gave her credit for. In 23 years of marriage, she had developed an ability to read the subtle signs of my emotional weather, to sense the storms brewing long before I acknowledged them myself. She knew about my evening walks, about the phone calls I took in another room, about the way I had been checking my reflection in mirrors as if trying to recognize the person staring back at me. I opened my mouth to give her some version of the truth, not the whole truth, because that would have required a courage I didn't yet possess, but enough truth to acknowledge that something fundamental was shifting in the careful architecture of our life together. But the words wouldn't come. How do you tell someone you love that you are not the person they married? That you have been playing a character for so long you have forgotten where the performance ends and the real self begins? Instead, I reached up and covered her hand with mine, a gesture that felt both intimate and final. I told her I was fine, that I was just tired, that the end of the semester always left me feeling unsettled. The lies came easily, but I could see in her eyes that she wasn't fooled. She nodded anyway, accepting my evasion with the grace that had characterized so much of our marriage. But there was something else in her expression, a sadness that suggested she understood more than she was letting on, a resignation that spoke of decisions she was preparing herself to accept. We didn't speak about it again, but the silence between us took on a different quality. Not the comfortable quiet of long marriage, but something heavier, charged with the weight of things that needed to be said but probably never would be. Clara began giving me more space, asking fewer questions about my evening walks, accepting my distraction with a patience that felt both loving and heartbreaking. It was during one of those walks, on a Thursday evening when the January air was so cold it burned my lungs, that I realized I couldn't continue living in this liminal space between two versions of myself. The pretense was exhausting, the constant performance of normalcy when every instinct in my body was pulling me towards something else, someone else, some truer version of the life I was meant to be living. I called Julian from my cell phone as I walked, my breath forming clouds in the freezing air. When he answered, I asked if he could meet me by the river. There was something in my voice that made him agree immediately, without questions or hesitation, as if he had been waiting for this call as inevitably as I had been working up the courage to make it. I found him standing at the same spot where we had first held hands, where he had asked me to show him why people found such simple contact so meaningful. The river moved darkly beside us, carrying chunks of ice that caught the reflected light from the street lamps and disappeared again into the current. The air between us felt heavy with unspoken words, with all the conversations we had been having around the edges of the truth, without ever quite approaching its center. Julian looked at me with the kind of attention that had always made me feel simultaneously exposed and understood, as if he could read the decision I was struggling toward before I fully recognized it myself. "Nathaniel," he said finally, his voice quiet in the winter stillness, "you look like a man about to jump off a cliff." The observation was so accurate, it almost made me laugh. That was exactly what this felt like, standing at the edge of something vast and unknowable, knowing that the only choices were to step back onto familiar ground or leap into whatever waited below. I told him about Clara, about the way she had looked at me that morning when she asked if something was wrong. I told him about the lies that came so easily now, about the exhaustion of maintaining a performance that felt less convincing every day. I told him about the essays I had been grading, about Gatsby's green light and the dreams we defer until they wither from neglect. Julian listened without interruption, his dark eyes reflecting understanding rather than judgment. When I finished talking, he was quiet for a long moment, his gaze fixed on the dark water moving past us. "You don't owe me anything," he said finally, his words careful and deliberate. "But you owe yourself something." The statement hit me like a physical blow, not because it was harsh, but because it was so precisely, inescapably true. For 48 years, I had been making choices based on what was expected of me, what was safe, what would cause the least disruption to the carefully ordered world I had inherited rather than created. I had spent so much energy trying to be the person other people needed me to be that I had lost track of who I actually was underneath all those accumulated roles and responsibilities. Standing there beside the river with Julian, I felt the weight of all those deferred choices, all those moments when I had chosen security over authenticity, duty over desire. The teenager who had been too afraid to reach for what he wanted. The young man who had married a good woman because she was safe rather than because she set his world on fire. The middle-aged teacher who had spent 25 years helping other people tell their stories while refusing to acknowledge his own. Julian was right. I owed myself something. I owed myself the chance to find out who I might become if I stopped being afraid of my own heart. The realization settled over me with a certainty that felt both terrifying and liberating. I couldn't keep both lives, the one I had built on compromise and careful distance, and the one that was calling to me with Julian's voice, Julian's laugh, Julian's hand waiting to be held. I had to choose, and for the first time in decades, the choice felt entirely my own to make. I turned to face him fully, this man who had been my first glimpse of a different kind of love, who had waited 25 years for me to become brave enough to claim it. Slowly, deliberately, I reached for his hand. Not with the hesitation I had felt that first evening by the river, not with the trembling uncertainty of someone afraid of being burned. This time, I took his hand with the quiet certainty of a man who had finally decided to stop running from his own truth. Our fingers interlaced perfectly, the way they always had, the way they were always meant to. The contact sent warmth racing up my arm and straight to my heart, reminding me what it felt like to touch another person not out of habit or duty, but out of genuine desire, genuine choice. I didn't say the words out loud. There would be time for words later, time for plans and difficult conversations, and all the practical complications of unraveling one life to build another. But standing there with Julian's hand in mine, feeling completely present in my own skin for the first time in memory, I knew this was it. This was the first real choice I had made for myself in decades, the first time I had chosen what I wanted rather than what was expected of me. The river moved beside us, carrying its burden of ice toward some distant destination, and I understood that I was like that water now, finally moving in the direction I was meant to go, finally following the current of my own heart rather than fighting against it. The morning I left came quietly, without fanfare or dramatic declarations. It was a Tuesday in February, the kind of winter dawn when the light filters through bare branches and frost covers the windows in delicate patterns that will disappear as soon as the sun climbs higher. I had been awake since 4, lying beside Clara and listening to her steady breathing, memorizing the sound of it, because I knew it would be the last time I would wake up in that particular configuration of bodies and breath and shared silence. I moved carefully as I got dressed, selecting clothes with the same attention I might have given to packing for a long journey to a place I had never been before. Which, I suppose, was exactly what I was doing. Each small action, pulling on jeans instead of the pressed khakis Clara usually set out for me, choosing a sweater I had bought myself rather than one she had given me for Christmas, felt like a tiny declaration of independence, a small step toward becoming someone I barely knew but was finally ready to meet. The house held the peculiar stillness of early morning, that suspended quiet before the day officially begins, and the familiar rhythms of domestic life resume. I made coffee, the sound of the machine unnaturally loud in the silence, and sat down at the kitchen table where I had eaten thousands of breakfasts over the course of 23 years. The chair felt different now, as if I were already becoming a visitor in my own life. On the table in front of me lay a stack of student essays I would never finish grading, a grocery list in Clara's careful handwriting, and the ceramic bowl where we kept spare keys and loose change. Ordinary objects that told the story of an ordinary life, each one carrying the weight of accumulated routine and shared purpose. They would all still be here after I left, continuing to exist without me, holding their places in a narrative I was about to step out of permanently. I sat there for nearly an hour, drinking coffee from my usual blue mug and watching the light change outside the window. The neighborhood was beginning to stir, a jogger moving past with earbuds and measured breathing, someone starting their car and letting it warm up in the driveway, the newspaper delivery truck making its methodical rounds. Normal people beginning normal days, their choices already made and settled into comfortable patterns. It would have been easy to stay, to finish the coffee, go upstairs and shower, put on the clothes Clara had selected, and slip back into the role I had been playing for so long it had become indistinguishable from my actual life. To choose safety over authenticity once again. To let the moment pass and convince myself that contentment was enough, that duty was a form of love, that some dreams were meant to remain dreams. But I thought about Julian, probably awake in his small apartment across town, painting by the morning light or reading with his coffee growing cold beside him. I thought about the way his hand had felt in mine that night by the river, about the certainty I had felt when I chose to hold on rather than pull away. I thought about all the years I had deferred my own happiness in service of other people's expectations, and I knew that if I stayed now, if I let this moment slip away, I would spend the rest of my life wondering who I might have been if I had been brave enough to find out. Slowly, I slipped the wedding ring off my finger. 23 years I had worn it, through seasons of comfort and stretches of quiet desperation, through the birth of our daughter and her eventual departure for college. It had become part of me, this circle of gold, as unconscious as breathing. Without it, my finger felt naked, exposed, strangely light. I set the ring on the table beside my empty coffee cup, where it caught the strengthening morning light and threw tiny rainbows across the kitchen wall. Such a small thing, really, to carry so much symbolic weight. But symbols matter, I had learned from teaching literature for 22 years. They carry truths too large to be spoken directly, meanings that exist in the spaces between what is said and what is understood. From the drawer where Clara kept her shopping lists and recipe cards, I took a piece of paper. Nothing special, just a torn corner from a magazine that had been sitting on the counter. I found a pen and wrote 4 words in my careful teacher's handwriting. I'm sorry. Be happy. It wasn't enough, could never be enough to explain or justify or make sense of what I was doing. How do you condense 23 years of marriage, 2 decades of shared history, into a few words on a scrap of paper? How do you tell someone you love that you are leaving not because of anything they have done wrong, but because staying would mean continuing to betray the deepest truth of who you are? I folded the note once and placed it beneath the wedding ring, a small pyramid of gold and paper that would have to speak for all the conversations we would never have, all the explanations that would never be adequate, all the apologies that would never be enough. Upstairs, I could hear Clara stirring, the familiar sounds of her morning routine beginning. In a few minutes, she would come downstairs expecting to find me reading the paper or checking my email, ready to begin another day of the careful choreography we had perfected over the years. Instead, she would find an empty chair and a wedding ring and a note that explained nothing and everything. I stood up slowly, feeling the weight of the moment settling over me like a coat I had been waiting my whole life to put on. My hand moved unconsciously to my side, fingers stretching as if reaching for another hand to hold, remembering the perfect fit of Julian's palm against mine. The gesture felt like muscle memory, like something my body had been practicing for decades without my conscious knowledge. At the back door, I paused with my hand on the knob, looking back at the kitchen table where I had left 23 years of my life reduced to a ring and a note. The morning light was stronger now, streaming through the windows and illuminating the familiar objects of domestic happiness. Clara's coffee mug with the chip on the handle, the fruit bowl she filled every Sunday, the small framed photo of Sarah's college graduation. It all looked exactly the same as it had every other morning, but something fundamental had shifted. I was no longer the man who belonged in this picture, no longer the person who could sit at that table and pretend that contentment was the same thing as joy, that duty was a substitute for desire, that half a life was better than no life at all. I opened the door and stepped outside into air that felt different against my skin. Cleaner somehow, less heavy, as if the atmosphere itself had been waiting for me to make this choice. The dawn was breaking properly now, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold that seemed impossibly beautiful, as if I were seeing color for the first time. For the first time in decades, I breathed deeply, filling my lungs with the cold morning air and feeling something expand in my chest that I had forgotten was there. Freedom, maybe, or possibility, or simply the recognition that I was finally, after 48 years of careful compromise, moving in the direction my heart had always wanted to go. I walked away from the house where I had spent more than half my life, each step carrying me further from the person I had been and closer to whoever I was about to become. Behind me, the morning light continued to stream through the kitchen windows, illuminating the empty chair and the wedding ring and the quiet evidence of a choice that had been 25 years in the making.